Good morning, and thank you everyone for joining us on this year panel, Gaza, Ukraine, and Nagorno-Karabakh, the challenges of covering conflict today. As if one conflict wasn't enough, two weren't enough, we're dealing with three of the most daunting, vexing, and complex issues. We're going to see what binds them together, if anything, and how the press does and ought to cover them.
In 2020, there was a new war, and this time Azerbaijan took more than 80% of the territory, the districts, and people thought that it was the end of the war. We will talk about this more, but basically always in the framing, it's when does it end? It's like this never-ending war, and in the media, it's always hard to know when it's over. But after 2020, a lot of people thought it was over, but it wasn't. And during 3 years, the conflict continued in a kind of slower pace. And we just assisted actually in 2023 to the kind of textbook example of ethnic cleansing, because there was a really short war, really 24 hours. And this time Azerbaijan took over all the territory, and all the Armenians who weren't killed during that war fled. So it's, more than 100,000 people who arrived in Armenia and are now refugees here. And basically for the first time, there are no Armenians left at all in Nagorno-Karabakh. So that was a really short way to explain for a complicated conflict. But basically now the angle that we can talk about now is about this ethnic cleansing that happened. And it has been a war that was very difficult to cover in the last 3 years, especially because there was basically no access for journalists, international journalists, after the 2020 war. And because it's also not easy to work from the Azerbaijani side, not easy to work from the Armenian side. So there are many, many challenges that we will discuss in more details later on.
Not only are these conflicts immensely complicated, every single one of our panelists basically gave us some version of, well, where do we begin? We go back 10 years, 15 years, 150 years. But also we are struggling to cover these conflicts objectively, accurately, with context and truth, while we live in an age in which social media are dominant, while a lot of mis and disinformation is spread all around, while a lot of media consumers are getting their information from a whole host of non-traditional sources. How do you train the new generation of journalists in a immensely complicated media landscape like this?
Well, I think everybody's sort of made my point for me. The fact that this is a very complex topic, or very complex topics to kind of cover for everyone. This will be sort of rudimentary for some people, foundational for others, but to think about the very basic idea of what we do as journalists, and that is to report facts and truth as we know it. And that's what I tell students all the time now, is that we have some things that we have sort of put to the side and said this is sort of impossible, sort of our objectivity to approach something in a very non-biased way. But the very basic idea of covering these conflicts has to be from a point of unbiased coverage as much as we possibly can. And that's sort of the general idea of how I want them to approach most any story that they have. Certainly there is an opportunity for advocacy, but that is not, in my mind, journalism. That is not exactly what we want to do if we're going to call ourselves journalists. So, and I would approach this in a couple of ways. This is looking at how we sort of frame these topics. We sort of look at them, honestly, traditionally in journalism as sort of horse races, right? And as Astrid said, some ways chronologically. So we look at who's winning and who's losing. We look at when it starts, when it ends, without looking at some of the nuances. And that's as everybody points out, the hardest part for us to kind of get into.
Do you believe we have an obligation to stir empathy as journalists? And if so, how? Mark Champion, maybe we'll turn to you first.
So interesting question. So I would say that I don't spend a lot of time thinking about, how am I going to encourage empathy in the readers. I think I tend to more think, so how do I explain to readers that this should matter to them, and that obviously gets to the point of how do you choose, which conflict. Obviously, you don't necessarily choose it on your own. You, as a news organization, you do so. You decide what's important and so on. But it is critical, I think, to keep reminding people of, why is this important? The war in Ukraine, it's a pretty easy sell in that sense, because you have, on one side, a major nuclear power, on the other, whether it's, economic in terms of transit routes for energy, whether it's, human in terms of refugees flooding into Europe, where your readers are, whether it's, financial military in the sense that, the US is involved, another major nuclear power in arming the Ukrainians. So it's not very difficult to tell them why they should care about that. Other conflicts become much more difficult. There are conflicts that have gone on for many years with huge death tolls in places like Congo in Africa. Really much harder to explain to people. So why do we need to care about this one?
We risk sometimes in the media being a little bit dishonest. You interview Hitler, but you're not taking a side. You interview Mother Teresa, but you're not taking a side. We want to be always objective, but there is subjectivity in the choice of the topic. Like, do you report on this conflict, but not on what's happening in Southern Sudan? There's subjectivity in what you choose to cram into the 1,000 words you have in a best case scenario for most news articles, and so on. It really is very difficult. At the end of the day, I find that history resolves this problem because something closer to a consensus emerges about things post factum that is difficult perhaps to foresee at the time that we're writing the rough draft of history. Essentially, I am always reminded of Carl Bernstein's famous quote that journalism amounts at the end of the day, when all is said and done, and we've concluded our semantic discussions and our theoretical discourse, to nothing more than an effort to achieve the best obtainable version of the truth.
So, Astrid, I want to launch off what Dan is saying and ask you a provocative question. Why do that? Why strive at all to the best obtainable version of the truth? Because sometimes, we see things as reporters, and we are human beings that just profoundly impact us. I have seen the video documentation, the GoPro cameras of Hamas's atrocious attacks. I have seen from the outskirts of Artsakh, the starvation forced by Azerbaijan. And it was very difficult to remain sort of dispassionate. Why not write a, profound call to action based on your, empathic, moral feelings? Why is objectivity even the baseline that we purport to aspire to?
Well, I guess as a journalist, you have to do your best to try to be. I don't believe in objectivity, as itself. Like, I don't think that really exists in journalism. But you have to be honest about what you're seeing and what you're reporting. And I just think we have to stick to international law. And even if, of course we feel emotions, I think that's normal. I think that's actually good. And if one day as a reporter, I don't feel any emotion reporting during war, I think maybe it's time to stop, because then you're also, it becomes dangerous the way you behave with your sources or people you might interview. But just for people to trust us and, to keep on reading the media, we have to try to. And I think we can also just be honest and say it if sometimes we have seen something that is deeply troubling for us. And you have seen a lot of reports, TV reports or anything where, you can say that those images are harrowing or what you're seeing is terrible, using terms like that. But then if you don't stick to the terms of international law and you start yourself calling this a genocide or this or that, then how are people supposed to, keep on trusting you and your reporting? That's why for me it's really the hard line. But then I do believe that the fact that other people are using those words and what you're seeing, you can combine all that when you're giving context to also explain why. For example, the word genocide, you were talking about it. A lot of Armenians are using it, a lot of people in general, and then also some international institutions even started using it, ethnic cleansing and genocide. But just, giving some context can help to explain why, because you're seeing this event that is horrible and all those deaths, and also there's history, and there's the fact that Armenians did experience a genocide in the 20th century. So there's this collective trauma, and that explains it. So just always giving context makes it okay to use the terms if you're explaining them and if you're not yourself qualifying what you're seeing. And even in Ukraine, I've also worked in Ukraine since the full-scale invasion, and even there, the word genocide, sometimes it comes, and also there's the trauma of Holodomor there, and also death by starvation during the Soviet times, right? So if you just describe honestly what you're saying, and yes, it can be horrible and it can have an impact on you, and then you give as much context as you can, but you're sticking to international law in your reporting, then I think that's just the best way to do your job in the best possible way, and to keep the trust of people who are reading you or watching your reports as much as possible. There will always be people who won't believe you or will have preconceptions, but having that hard line is the only way to make people trust your reporting.
I think that in general, I think there's been a remarkable amount of very high quality journalism done out of Ukraine. People taking high risk in order to figure out exactly what's happening at a given moment. And to try and get that across, spending a lot of time, a lot of, huge teams of people, huge amount of money in order to do so. I think there are very significant limitations, and that we really struggle to get over those. So like I was saying at the beginning, this is a war you can cover from one side. I just before the war, I went to Mariupol, for example, because I knew that that's where the war would really start, having been there many times before in 2014, 15, etc. And I wanted to see what was going on, and I would love to go back there now. I can't, right? I mean, I would so like to go and see what's actually happening in Mariupol, to see, talk to the people who remained and see what they think. It's a very complicated town. It always was. I'd love to go do that stuff, but I cannot, because I can't go to Russia to do it. I won't be allowed to, even if I go to Russia, I won't be allowed to go to Mariupol and do my job. So there are, severe limitations, but, within those limitations, I think in general, a lot of good work has been done, basically.
Excellent. Dan Perry, rapid fire, give us a grade.
Look, C. Basically, whenever you judge success or failure, you have to take into account the goal. If the goal of the media is to provide sophisticated, nuanced, and forward-looking, useful coverage of these conflicts, then clearly the grade may be an F. We have a complex situation here. Text is under-resourced, basically, because the media's business model, by and large, is falling apart. Those text reporters and others, photojournalists and videographers on the ground, are doing great work, no doubt about it, in all three conflicts. But the larger organization basically, I think, doesn't think their audience wants much of this nuanced coverage that would constitute great coverage. And certainly with broadcast, it tends to be very superficial. And the biggest failure maybe is the mainstream media that is going to be the only source, realistically, most of the source, other than a few bloggers, of sophisticated, nuanced, and great coverage, has completely failed in taking the story to social media, which is where the youth are today.
Given all the things that we've heard here on the panel today, all the complexities and difficulties, if a young student were to come to you and say, Professor, I'm really thinking about a career as a sort of like war correspondent, the conflict coverage journalist, would you recommend it?
Yes. If they're passionate about it, then absolutely. If they feel like they can be a great storyteller, then absolutely. We teach here a couple of courses on foreign correspondence. We teach journalism and trauma. There's some things that we need to do to prepare them, certainly. But beyond that, yeah, I would absolutely recommend it. I didn't have the fortune to do it myself, but yeah, I think it's absolutely well, you can ask everybody else on the panel if they felt like it's been rewarding for them to be a part of the telling these stories. But absolutely, it's so necessary and so important, and especially these days, these kids really have a passion. While I try to weed out the idea that, you know, advocacy is something else, but they definitely want to tell stories. They definitely want to tell stories of people, and often they may be something that they, you know, maybe a little bit misguided about some of the players and their agendas, but certainly they care about what's happening in the world.
Astrid, if a young reporter came to you and said, I'm following in your footsteps, I'm going to, you know, get in the game, I'm going to cover conflict, what are some, you know, one or two pieces of advice you would give her?
Well, I'm a young reporter myself, and I just started 3 years ago and already covered 3 wars, which I didn't really expect. So I would say go for it, because I cannot say not to do it when I'm doing it. I think just the most important thing is, unfortunately, the media industry is not really good, and most of us are freelancers. So try to find a way and find financement, you know, to be able to do a HIFAT training, to be trained before you go to an actual war zone, to know how to react, to find PPE, protective equipment, to, you know, think about all those things beforehand, because it is a war zone. And if you want to be able to do your job and to stay alive, you have to be prepared. So that would be the biggest advice, is to really not take it lightly and prepare for it.
You have to be a lover of humanity. If you really are, if you know how to deal with people, if you want a better future for our world, then there can be few greater vocations than, I think, journalism.
Mark Champion, we give you the last word with a particularly thorny question, which is, which conflicts that we have not discussed today do you anticipate making headlines tomorrow?
So that they are already conflicts now, or that they are to be?
I respect and shudder at the premise of your answer, but take it in whatever direction that you wish.
Well, I mean, you know, so we are all terrible forecasters of wars. They tend to happen where we don't expect them, and not to happen where we do. You know, but obviously the one that, you know, everybody is most frightened of, because there you really do have major geopolitical implications, is if anything should happen in Taiwan. And, you know, we will be writing about that conflict as a conflict for years, even if it never happens, because if it did, it would be so, the implications would be so appalling.
I think you took us precisely to where we need to be. And for it, Mark Champion, Astrid Hagopian, Professor Mark Turner, Dan Perry, thank you so much for your wonderful, enlightening comments. And may all these conflicts be resolved soonest. Amen. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent.